All right, today I'll be talking about Charlie Kaufman's Antkind, which is really just the worst kind of book to talk about because even in my usual format, which is brief summary, why I chose this book, recommendation, pros, cons, and then a brief thematic exploration, it is the kind of large postmodern novel that becomes multiple different types of books as you read it, and consequently, even to give a summary of the book would require quite a bit of time because the book intentionally defies that kind of traditional structure. And I'm aware that a lot of postmodern books do this, especially most famously like Pynchon, I don't know how to pronounce it, and like David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, these big postmodern books that I just personally am not a fan of. So it might make you wonder why I picked Antkind, and the answer is, frankly, I was looking into modern versions of Kafka, surrealism. I love surrealism, and so I was looking for American surrealism, and surrealism didn't really take off in America the same way that it did in Europe and the rest of the world. And when I kept looking for examples of American surrealism, this was the book that kept coming up. And even though it didn't look like the kind of thing that I would enjoy, I decided to give it a shot. And admittedly, after the first 10 or so pages made me concerned. But after that, it really settled into a nice pace and became a very lovely read for about 200 pages. And after that, it became a bit of a slog. And then before kind of just derailing into a giant whatever until by the end of it, I was just so disinterested that I powered through the last 200 pages in a single day, which is pretty much where I'm coming at now. So if I sound unenthusiastic, that's why. Because, I mean, it's a bastard of a book because even the concept of a simple recommendation is like, I would recommend the first 150 to 200 pages, but after that, I don't know, not really. Because it's difficult to imagine somebody willing to put up with a lot of what goes on in this book. I mean, there's a lot of funny parts to it. It's a funny book, but the question is whether or not these small little not blips, but these sort of small episodes of humor are going to be enough for you to compel you through 700 pages of something that is, by design, meant to infuriate in its structure. And while I certainly am not infuriated and I don't come away hating the book, I just come away from it feeling like I just didn't get much out of it. So your mileage may vary. I cannot, in good faith, recommend this book, even though I don't hate it and even though I think there are some parts of it that are dead-ass funny. But then again, I also remember and will never forget the video phone segment of Infinite Jest, which to this day remains one of the funniest little page to 2 page bits that I've ever read in anything. But, on the whole, I got like 250 pages into Infinite Jest before I just stopped caring. And that's the thing with these kinds of books, is a lot of the people who praise them for their wit. And I see a lot of, if you didn't enjoy it, you just don't get it around them. And, I get that they're clever, and okay, with Charlie Kaufman, there's a lot of film references, and I get some of the references enough to appreciate that, okay, I see what he's doing here, but whether or not that in turn makes for necessarily a clever narrative or a clever construct, I am personally not swayed or convinced. So if this is your kind of thing, go for it. Otherwise, I can't, like I said, in good conscience, recommend it. And I suppose to sort of give a brief synopsis as well as I can. I mean, I can just read the back of the book. B. Rosenberg, a neurotic and underappreciated film critic, and to add my own little bit here, very much a take on the modern super woke individual, the self-hating white male liberal, to the point of near parody, though not necessarily, because increasingly parody becomes reality. And the constant riffing and satire against this type of individual was absolutely my favorite part of the book. Anyway, stumbles upon a hitherto unseen film by an enigmatic outsider, a 3-month-long stop-motion masterpiece that took its reclusive auteur 90 years to complete. B knows that his mission is to show it to the rest of humanity. The only problem, the film is destroyed. All that's left is a single frame from which B must somehow to attempt to recall all work of art. That might just be the last great hope of civilization. The last part, last great hope of civilization, is a bit of a misleader. Certainly, B believes this to be something that will make all life better, but part of the point of the book is that that's entirely on him. He is placing way too much value in this film made by Ingo, who is an African-American man, that he initially has no interest in until he discovers that he's African-American, again tying into that play on the quote-unquote woke sort of left liberal-leaning individual. And, lest you think that this is a very right-leaning book, it's not. Kaufman himself is probably a very liberal individual, and there's plenty poking fun of Trump. In fact, there's a character named Donald Trunk who is very clearly a parody of Trump. So it avoids being one-sided in that sense, but in terms of having a plot, it just falls off after about 200 pages, which is after he finds Ingo, sees the film, and then is very, very moved by it, and it gets destroyed in a fire. He's in a coma for 3 months, and then spends about the next 250 to 400 pages going to a hypnotist trying to remember the film. And it's during these parts that the book really just starts to drag, going between his sort of memories of the film becoming a story within a story, possibly within a story, and then just random segments from his own life that become increasingly bizarre and nonsensical, and they don't connect. They don't feel like it's building towards anything, which is ultimately my big problem. And to sort of move into the pros and the cons, doing this out of order, but, to move into the pros and the cons, that's what it comes down to. Pros: very funny book. Very witty. I love some of the observation, and the early parts of the book, when it has a narrative around it, are highly enjoyable. But then once you hit that 200-page mark, it stops feeling like there's a narrative. It stops feeling like this has any purpose or meaning. It stops feeling like it's building towards anything. And while certainly the lack of function and the frustration and the absence of meaning is part of the point of the book, it's not particularly a point that I care much for, and it's not necessarily a point I particularly agree with. Like, I see what's going on, I see what's being done, but it just falls flat for me. It's like an aesthetic that just doesn't do anything for you. You can sort of look at it, you can kind of appreciate when it's well done and when it's not well done. And I mean, here I'd say it's certainly no Pynchon or Wallace, but it's competent, not incompetent, just above average, I guess, is where I'd put it. But that lack of focus until you hit about page 450, where things sort of start to pick up again, but then they immediately plunge back into strangeness. And again, the question of just where is this all going, only for the answer to be that it's not going anywhere, is, for me, disheartening and kind of goes against what I personally look for in fiction. Because while you can argue, journey over destination, to me, without a destination, the whole thing becomes sort of impossible to fully analyze. I like to think of it, I like to think of a story as having a sort of three-dimensional object in your hand. And once you've finished it, you can see the whole thing in 3 dimensions, and then you can twist it, you can examine it front to back to front, all the little parts, twist it, arrange it, look at it top to bottom, left to right, whatever, up to down, and sort of appreciate it that way. The problem with these kinds of stories that deny you that kind of ending, that kind of closure, that kind of satisfaction, in which sort of just the episodes themselves are the point, is that it denies that ability to sort of twist it, turn it, examine the thing in its entirety, because there is no entirety, there is no closed end. The book physically ends, but the story, the plot, is just kind of left on a cliffhanger. Not really a cliffhanger, but it just kind of stops. It doesn't end, it just stops. Ostensibly, if Kaufman wanted to keep on writing, he'd keep on writing into oblivion the same nonsense. And I don't say that in a derogatory or derivative way, but ultimately the same sort of nonsense one-off. Things that make you go, oh, that's witty, or that's clever, or get a chuckle out of you, memorable stories. But where this all falls through to me and falls flat is that really great authors, I think, have this sort of bizarreness and work this bizarreness into things while also still having a plot and characters. I'm really reminded of Kafka and of Kurt Vonnegut, where in a lot of ways what makes Kafka and Vonnegut work for me is the shorter lengths of their book. Because both Kafka and Vonnegut are very astute, both write really interesting worlds with very short, or with sort of characters that are more caricatures than people with really any depth or dimensionality to them, and in a sense are more a commentary on society than necessarily the individual humanity or the lived experience of being human. And being just these short, obviously Kafka never finished a book famously, but The Castle is like 200 something pages. The Trial is shorter than even that. And then you look at Vonnegut, you look at something like Slaughterhouse-Five, and again, Slaughterhouse-Five, Cat's Cradle, Breakfast of Champions, all very short books that you can easily read in a day or two. And it works because they make their jokes, it's funny, and then it's over. It's, if I look at TV, there's kind of a reason that comedy shows tend to be shorter and tend to be more episodic and stand on their own, as opposed to something like drama where it really benefits from having the longer time because you can sort of get into the heads of the characters, develop them better, add more dimensions to them, which is something that just doesn't happen in Antkind, where at the end, by the end of the book, the main character is as much of a shell and as he was at the start, as much of, sort of existing as a caricature to laugh at rather than really a fully bodied individual. And the same goes for all the characters around him. None of them are super deep, super involving. To put it another way, none of them feel like people. And in Kafka, again, talking about like The Trial, where you have all these zany, wacky characters who aren't super deep, but are, sort of more meant to represent something. And the only people that you really get a good, strong grasp on, and even then, it's not like Kay, either in The Trial or in The Castle, is not a super deep character, but that's not what Kafka is trying to do. But he accomplishes it in, his unfinished novel in a third of the space that Kaufman has used here. And that's just where I end up with this book is more, I don't want to say more accomplished writers, but this has been done. It has been done shorter, and I cannot help but feel like the length is not adding anything to the experience. And this is just ultimately how I feel about this specific type of postmodern book. And it makes it difficult to even talk about the themes because, thematically, there is a lot of stuff in here, like making fun of the people, making fun of the woke, the enlightened individual, both from a political standpoint, but also from the standpoint of understanding fiction and believing that there's only one way to look at fiction and believing that that is the right way. I mean, the sort of downward spiral into derangement is this main character who is a film critic, and his belief that he is the only one who can not only convey this film to the world through recreating it, but can convey the right way of looking at the film and interpreting the film, which then involves him first of all rediscovering the film, but then also determining how to interpret it. And it's just mocking that entire idea, which I don't take to be mocking the idea of searching for meaning in things so much as I take it to be mocking the idea of people who believe that they have already found the meaning and that all other meanings are wrong or have no value, and that the only way of looking at things is their way. So in that sense, again, something I do agree with, a part of the book that I absolutely enjoyed. And to be fair, it's not about agree or disagree so much as the way it's conveyed. And the meaninglessness, it doesn't frustrate me because I disagree with it so much as it just kind of feels at odds with some of the other aspects of the novel that do sort of lend a more sentimental edge to things and a less cynical outlook. So, there is in all of this a love of film. Even if it is being filtered through this cynical bastard, there is absolutely a sort of appreciation for art and the importance of art and the way that art does affect how we look at the world. But at the same time, there is, a sort of appreciation to the limitations of that, to people who think that because they have experienced art, they know better than people who have lived real events and things like that. So it's a fairly balanced take in that sense, but it's difficult to reconcile the sort of meaninglessness of the endeavor to reconcile sort of the meaninglessness of B's endeavor with like the later happiness that the alternate B discovers in sort of just being more accepting, being more open, and not getting so stressed out about believing he knows everything. And even the sort of one-page version of reality where he watches the film and embraces the film's message and decides to stop being critical and to sort of just accept things as they are. And there's a happiness there. And it ends on, kind of talking about memory, which is kind of a theme, but kind of not, in the sense that, all it's sort of really saying is that memory is infallible, or not infallible, rather fallible. Memory is highly fallible, and yet we treat it as infallible, and that leads to a lot of problems. So it's kind of there, but it's not a big point, because ultimately that's what is being said, more or less, that I could take away from it. And, that's coming to the end of it. Sort of my takeaway from the whole book is that there are things I got, there are things I kind of didn't get, and the book almost mocks in a way the very idea of me coming here trying to record my thoughts as though those fucking count for anything, because anybody is free to read it and interpret it and make of it what they will. And while I appreciate that, I can't say that this particular experience was the sort of best most fun way I've had of going through that. But it is a good reminder, to anything I've tried to say it multiple times on any of my videos, that these are my takes. And, here's a book that basically dares you to say anything else. But it's not my type of thing. And if I struggle to recommend it or talk about it too much, it's because it's just very, very big, very, very all over the place. And I typically like big books. All of my favorite books are 600 to 800 page books, but they're not 6 to 800 page postmodernist books. So not quite my thing. But if it sounds up your alley, if you are a fan of Pynchon, if you are a fan of Wallace, if you are a fan of oh god, I cannot remember his name anymore, but there are plenty of authors like this, and this seems to be, well, not necessarily up there with the best, certainly something that would be worthy of your time if you're into that sort of thing. So at the behest of saying anything else, I think I've exhausted all I can say about Antkind, which is funny because the book itself is 700 pages, and yet this review is barely 20 minutes. But what can I say? Sometimes things work for you and sometimes they don't. So until next time.